Hello and welcome to this talk from the BRLSI, the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. I'm John Higgins. I'm the convener for robotics, artificial intelligence and all things digital technology. It's my pleasure today to be talking to Julie Barnett, who is a professor at our local university, the University of Bath. And Julie's done extensive research into the issue of loneliness. And what we want to talk about today is loneliness, what it is, but how technology can help us during the lockdown, particularly with some of the difficult times that lots of people are having. Julie, when I was looking at the sort of preparations for this, and I was thinking, well, what is the difference between loneliness and just isolation? And I was thinking about, well, Wordsworth, when he wrote, "I wandered lonely as a cloud," he talked about the bliss of solitude. So is loneliness always a bad thing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting first question, John. And I think, so we think about two things really, social isolation and loneliness. And actually conceptually, they're quite distinct. So as in one can be lonely when one's not socially isolated, and one can be, there's various combinations. You can obviously be socially isolated and lonely as well. And you're introducing another interesting concept there, which is that of solitude, which I guess solitude is the experience of isolation, but there's a positive experience. It is often sort of associated with perhaps with creativity, with withdrawing oneself and then coming back into social life where you're bringing something good back into society. But that actually, there's not very much research, or at least there's nowhere near as much research around solitude and the positive benefits of isolation as there is around what is our main topic today, where we're talking more about loneliness. But it is important to distinguish loneliness from social isolation, as well as distinguishing it also from solitude.
And how do you do that then? What are the main differences when you're thinking about loneliness and isolation? I mean, what are the characteristics of loneliness?
Well, I guess the main thing about loneliness is it is a subjective negative feeling which is associated with there being a lack of connection and a lack of relationships often. We do make a distinction between emotional loneliness, which is often associated with the loss of particular relationships, for example, in a bereavement. But also we think about social loneliness, which is more about the general lack of connection and engagement, for example, in more of a community type setting. And that's the type of loneliness that where I've been working a little bit more in that sort of the lack of social connection and the way that might be associated with loneliness.
And another particular patterns or particular aspects of loneliness that you've identified? Have you grouped it and categorized it in some way?
Well, I guess if we look at the general research, I mean, there's obviously a lot of focus on, well, for a start, has loneliness increased, but also secondly, actually, who are the groups that are most lonely? So that is one of the areas where a lot of large-scale survey research has addressed this in order to actually understand who are the groups in society, who are the people in society that are most affected by loneliness, that feel the most lonely. So I guess, interestingly, actually, in terms of change over time, there is really, although we sometimes talk about, one hears talk in the media about an epidemic of loneliness, for example, there's actually not evidence for the fact that that loneliness has particularly increased in recent years. It's we've sort of conceptualized it that way for reasons we might talk about later, but actually there's not very much evidence that it has increased. And another sort of stereotype that we can in a way lay to rest is the fact that it's not always older people that are lonely. We tend to associate loneliness with old age. And actually recent work, Office of National Statistics, the big BBC loneliness experiment that was recently carried out, actually showed that younger people, aged 16 to 24, for example, particularly, were those that were most, or at least most reported as being lonely, which sort of counters the idea that we have of loneliness being most associated with older age.
There's been a degree of loneliness in society then, is what you've been saying. I mean, is there and it's not been increasing particularly, but is there a measure of it? I mean, is it like a tenth of the population at any given time, or half, or how is it measured?
Yes, well, actually, yes, there are measures like that, but that almost draws attention to the fact that one of the things that the recent work has done is to actually try and identify a good measure of loneliness, i.e. how we measure loneliness is very important. The levels we come up with, the percentages we come up with are a function of the way in which we measure it. And actually, we don't have research that really shows consistent measures of that over time. We've just started to do that. So I think that we will start to find much clearer indications of percentages that are lonely once we're using the same measures.
But there's been more attention paid to loneliness recently. So, I mean, somebody, who's making policy, somebody must think it's a problem that needs to be dealt with. And we'll come in a minute to talk about how technology can help with dealing with that problem. But, I mean, so why are we paying more attention to it if we're not measuring it and we doesn't seem to be getting worse?
Yeah, well, we are measuring it, but but we don't have the same measure going back over years. But we do, we know that it's always been with us in one sense. So then it is a very good question as to say, well, if it's not increasing, if we don't have this epidemic, why are we taking notice? And I think there's several reasons for that, and probably the main one is that we've really come to understand some of the negative impacts of loneliness. We know that it leads to decreased well-being in terms of physical and mental health. It's associated and it causes an increase in physical and mental health problems. So probably overwhelmingly, that is the main reason for increased attention, increased policy, increased government attention to that.
So we sort of need to understand how damaging it can be, and both damaging at a personal level, but damaging at a sort of societal cost level. I mean,
yeah. So I mean, in terms of a personal level, there's often, we often hear things about, that it's worse for us than smoking X number of cigarettes a day. It's worse than, the problem of obesity and so on. So that's the sort of comparators that are made in terms of identifying it. And increasingly is sort of identified as a public health problem. So that's one of the reasons for the government attention. And also it is, it's linked with increased presentation at our GPs in health services when there may not be physical problems that the GP can help with, but actually that this is something that, it's been a resource drain, if you like, on the health services, and we need to recognise what it is and actually think about in more appropriate ways of actually addressing it. As well as also, I think there's a question of employers noticing the sorts of problems that might be associated with it, and that obviously then the government also becomes very interested for those reasons as well. So I think those things together. And actually, I should also say that the sort of impetus within the UK really came with the Jo Cox, an MP that was sadly murdered some years ago. Her passion really, and the thing that she was all about addressing in Parliament was about loneliness, and to some extent the government have really taken that on since that time, have set up the loneliness work where they've actually ended up rolling out a number of policies and indeed continuing to sort of invest in this area.
So have you've been looking at some particular groups, I think, carers, for example. Is it the case that there are general remedies and solutions across all sorts of loneliness, or do some particular solutions lend themselves to treatment of loneliness in particular groups?
Yeah, no, that's another range question. So let me say first, so the last bit of your question about whether certain interventions, for example, work better with certain sorts of groups. Certainly, there's been reviews of, if you like, what works by a centre called What Works in Wellbeing, And one of the things that they really found was the importance of bespoke solutions. There's not a one size fits all. So thinking really carefully about the groups and the people that you're actually seeking to work alongside. So that was one of the things they found, was that, the importance of bespoke solutions. Another thing that they found was the importance of actually seeking to reduce the stigma of loneliness, it being something that was actually understood as that there's nothing shameful about it, that it's something that we can all experience. Often that is because loneliness is related to transitions we have in our lives. That may be transitions like the transition of a bereavement, it might be the transition of a divorce, it may be the transition of having a baby, of moving house, of changing job. And so in that sense, these things are, absolutely integral to our lives, and they can occasion and be linked with loneliness. So actually reducing stigma is something that is really important. But to come on to your question of the particular groups that we've worked with, so I was involved in a project with various colleagues from other universities where we were starting to think about technology and loneliness. And one of the groups that we chose to look at was informal carers. The reason for that was that they undergo a transition to becoming a carer. And we understand, loneliness is not necessarily a chronic state. It often can be occasioned by a transition. And secondly, carers are informal carers are really a group that are really increasing in number in society. And we understood that often the caring brings responsibility, often increased isolation from other people that are not involved in the care of that person, and so on. So we felt that was a really important group to actually look at. So that was indeed, one of the groups that we looked at.
Can we turn to, so what can we do about it, or what can individuals do about it, and also what technology can do? We've all turned into Zoomies, haven't we, over the last 8 or 9 weeks now, and we're on. I mean, are these sorts of things helpful? Do they? In what ways does technology help? And, how is that as part of an overall set of things that people can do?
Yes. Well, the first thing, immediately we say technology. If we start to think about something like social media, we start to immediately get into this sort of bad press, really, that if we think about interventions about, our digital connections with people, Zoom, Teams, WhatsApp, texting, Facebook, etc., the evidence is hugely mixed there. And that's often because, we're talking, studies comparing, one study looking at apples, another one's looking at pears, and it's very difficult to get a clear view. But overall, the relation, the findings are that these are complex relationships. Sometimes social media type technologies can be really helpful. Other times they're much less helpful. For example, when they're enhancing established relationships, they can be quite helpful. If the interventions are extremely short-lived, that would be an example of when they might be less helpful. So it's complicated is probably one way of starting to put it. So the second point is to say that if we're thinking about digital technology, it's so important to remember how many people don't have access to digital technology. I mean, the Office of National Statistics have done, a lot of work around this. I think over 5 million adults are classed adults in the UK are classed as non-internet users, which means that they either have never used it or have not used it within the last 3 months. So we can't just rush into thinking about, for example, if we take the pandemic as an example, we can't start in wartime, if you like, trying to teach people about, how to use technology when we've not done that in peacetime. I'm not likening the pandemic to a war, but I'm just, we can't, when there's a crisis, actually start to teach people. We need to do that in a more gradual and thought through fashion. Indeed, there are lots of organisations that are doing that. So we can't just simply think about digital being the solution when there's lots of people that don't have that access.
But can it be one of the solutions? And
absolutely.
How? Yeah. So if
Yeah.
you have got access to it.
Yes. So if you do, so for example, with the work, well, again, just to come back to the pandemic again, I mean, there are thousands of organisations in the UK that have started to build community links to go into help people in very practical ways through the use of digital networks, whether it's WhatsApp, Facebook, and so on. Mutual aid organisations. So technology has had a massive role actually within this pandemic in building connections, people identifying, you know, in my group, in my road here in Bath, you know, there's been a group set up, a WhatsApp group that particularly in the early stages seemed to be really important in actually making people aware where there might be need for extra help in the road. So that's a really good example of how existing technologies have been appropriated to be used in this context. And within the work we did on carers, we also set out there to think about what particular technology might we build, might we design that is going to be important to carers. And this comes back to this idea of things needing to be bespoke, not simply off the shelf. And so we went through a process of co-design, working with carers, understanding their situation and understanding what sorts of what sort of technology might fit in with their situations, fit in with their lives. And you know, we developed a sort of a prototype which we tested out with carers and actually had a lot of good feedback, and hopefully at some point we'll get a bit more money to do a bit more work to develop that further.
What did it do?
Okay, well, it was one of the things that it was basically like a digital radio. We called it Chatter, and we really recognised that for carers, they've got the issue of not easily being able to go out, not easily being able to be spontaneous. So if we're designing for something in the home, it can't be that, you know, we're all going to log on at 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
As one might think, well, actually, then you can see people that, you know, are in the same situation as like-minded. The daily routines of caring for people don't allow for that type of spontaneity, and, you know, the situations are much more restricted. So this radio, as it were, that we built was something that allowed people to share their stories. It was to be used within a small group, a small network of carers. It allowed people to share their stories, share their experiences, allowed them to ask for advice from other carers, people who understood the situation that they were in. It had different, like a radio, it had different channels for sharing their stories, for picking up relevant types of news to them. And that was an example of design that was specifically aimed at the life situations, as it were, of carers.
In the last couple of minutes, could we explore some of the things you might not have looked at yet? I mean, maybe you have, like AI chatbots and robots. I hear that in Japan, robots are helping care for elderly people, and I saw some people interacting with a robot dog. I mean, what about some of these sorts of more advanced technologies? Do you think there's much promise in them?
Yes, I mean, I think that, well, certainly, as you say, it's an area of research that's taking off. And I think, for example, even the sort of Alexa type devices.
Two labs will probably go off in the background, yeah.
Yeah. So I suppose my own view is that a lot of the ways in which technology works is to enhance face-to-face contact.
Yeah.
So I think there can be plenty of robot-like devices that might actually have a role in doing that. There's a company in Sweden actually called I think they're called No Isolation, that have actually built that type of device for use in very specific situations. I think one of the situations is where there are children that are needing to be schooled in hospital that can be actually linked into their classroom through this little sort of mini robot. So absolutely, I think, you know, we need to explore that. But again, it needs to be thought of in a way that is bespoke, where possible, to enhance and amplify face-to-face contact rather than being a substitute.
Mm. And let's finish by just asking you what one piece of advice, or one or two pieces of advice, you would give someone who might be feeling lonely or suspecting they're feeling lonely. I mean, what would be the first or second thing that they would do?
Yeah, well, I mean, and researchers looked at this as well, actually, and the recent BBC loneliness experiment, they actually asked people, I mean, they had thousands of replies, and they actually asked people what sort of things. So that's one type of evidence, by asking people directly. And people said the things that they'd found helpful, as an example. And of course, sometimes when you are in a situation of feeling lonely, you feel you can't do these things. But it included things like sometimes finding things to distract you, especially if the loneliness is temporary, transitional, moving jobs, you know, moving house and so on, where you just don't know people. It would be about, you know, just distract yourself with activities that you enjoy doing, and because some of those feelings, if it is a transition, they'll pass. It's an obvious thing to say, but a true thing to say is to look to take up social activities, things that you enjoy doing, i.e. you're not going because you're lonely, you're going because you enjoy doing the thing. A choir, joining a woodwork class, you know, whatever it is that people do, play bridge and so on. Actually, where the end you have in mind is to do the thing you enjoy doing, but it's alongside other people as well, where you can start to you know, get to know people a bit as well. And even in the pandemic, there's lots of things people have started to do. Choirs, for example. There's a no isolation choir, where there's something about doing things alongside other people that you love doing. And I think also, you know, where you get the chance is to start conversations. You know, and again, at the moment, as we walk past houses, if there's someone at the door and so on, we can just say hello and have a conversation, even at that small level. You know, I think these things help.
Great, and that's good advice to finish on. So, Professor Julie Barnett, thank you very much for talking to us at the BRLSI, and we'll look forward to talking to you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.